Thank you very much, Vicky, for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And it's a real honour to talk about my work on gaming in a context that's really totally new to me. And I look forward to learning from you all in the discussion today. So I've chosen this cover image of a gaming store in London, just to emphasise the point that although our interest today is in the digital, what happens online often has an offline counterpart as well. And in the case of the particular gaming community I'm interested in, it's played online, but also offline in a paper card game form as well. So before talking about the gaming community I've been researching, I want to talk a little bit about something called Gamergate that some of you might have come across. But I'd like to introduce this as it's perhaps the biggest issue that brings together people in the alt-right with people in the gaming community. And the premise of Gamergate is that in 2014, the ex-boyfriend of a games developer, Zoe Quinn, accused them of having sex with a gaming journalist in return for a positive review. And the outcome of this online rant, basically from an angry ex-boyfriend, resulted in Zoe Quinn being attacked by online mobs. She received death and rape threats and was forced into hiding due to being doxxed. So her contact details, offline contact details, released online, and those of her parents. And those who spoke out in support of her, such as Anita Sarkeesian and Brianna Wu, also became the target of these online misogynistic hate mobs. And the reason I raise this is there are a few themes that come out of Gamergate that I think are relevant to wider discussions about the alt-right. Firstly, that the people trolling these games developers thought that they had a rational justification for this. They were arguing that it was about ethics in games journalism that was causing them, or trying to protect ethics that was causing them to do this. Secondly, there was a cognitive dissonance. It didn't matter when they found out that actually no reviews had been written of this game and it was completely made up. It didn't stop them trolling. Thirdly, there was a kind of reactionary response as well. A wish amongst gamers to get back to so-called good old days when games and technology in general were the preserve of men and no one bothered them with things like political correctness and feminism. So nostalgia for a perceived good old days is of course a key aspect of right-wing views more generally. And then also, as I mentioned, there was an offline danger, even though it was mainly an online issue. So we can't just say, just ignore the trolls, because there's real danger associated with it. And also in the discourse of Gamergate, we see crossovers. I mean, it was basically a misogynistic activities, but we see crossovers with other forms of hate speech. So, for example, Anita Sarkeesian was referred to on Reddit and in the 4chan forums as Anita Jewkeesian. And the Gamergate activities were seen as a recruiting ground for the alt-right. As Rob said, it's a bit of an overstatement to say that Gamergate got Trump into power, as some journalists reported at the time. But people like Steve Bannon and other aides to Trump were recruiting within Gamergate communities and certainly used some of the tools that they used in terms of memes to attack Hillary Clinton as well. So the gaming community that I've been researching are the players of a game called Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering was the original trading card game. It was launched in 1993, and it has a huge cultural significance to gaming communities and so-called geek communities more generally, even people who don't necessarily play Magic now because it's been around for so long. So much part of geek culture, they might have played at one point or at least aware of it. It also has a widest cultural significance because it grew up alongside the internet. So Magic playing communities were some of the early adopters of the internet as well. And I've been focusing on a few different areas of the game, particularly around the company that makes Magic, Wizards of the Coast, their brand activism around representation in card art and narratives, but also issues of vulnerable masculinities and the way in which certain players want to try and protect community identity and boundaries and community spaces. And so I hadn't been looking at anti-Semitism as part of this, but in preparing for today, I've gained a greater understanding of the way in which anti-Semitic codes are used as a kind of dog whistle to others on the right, or, and just as worryingly, the way in which anti-Semitic tropes are used as a kind of background hate to the more explicit backlashes against feminism or ethnic diversity efforts in the game. And I should just add that a caveat that I'm not saying that Magic players are supporters of the alt-right at all. I play Magic myself, but I'm highlighting ways in which there might be overlaps between these communities. So Magic the Gathering has been through, the company has been through a series of phases that we can look at as more or less politically correct at different times. And I'll share some examples of this. So last year, in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, Wizards of the Coast banned a number of Magic cards and removed their images from the card database. And this occurred alongside something that had been going on for a few years, which is increasing the representation of women, but also ethnic minorities in the card games and narratives, such as Kaya, who's represented on this slide. And a number of the cards that were banned referred to either black or white creatures. As you can see on the slide, all white creatures gain. But it should be noted that actually there are also green, blue, and red creatures, so it's not just black and white creatures in the game. But the most discussed card was this card, Invoke Prejudice, that I've also shown on the slide. And there are a number of things about this card which each on their own you could possibly just about say might be a coincidence, but brought together there's certainly something nasty going on here. So firstly, and most obviously, the KKK imagery in the card art. Secondly, the card itself, the mechanics of the card require your opponent to have a spell of a different colour from your own. Thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, the artist, Harold McNeil, turned out to be a massive neo-Nazi. In his other art, uses lots of Nazi symbolism. And fourthly, and this is where it kind of falls into the risk of conspiracy theories, in the Magic card database, this card was given the ID 1488 or 1488, which some of you might know is a Nazi code. So now when you look at this card on the database, you see this image instead. The card has been removed from the game. So these are old cards, but they've been discussed for years, and the fact that they've only just been banned suggests the reluctance of Wizards to address past issues. But things are changing, and I think this is related to consumer demands for increased brand activism. And the representation of women is another issue that's come up too. So this card, Spike. Spike is the most competitive psychography in the game of Magic. So the idea of Spike as the type of player who really wants to be competitive above all else. And importantly, in 2017, when this character Spike was represented visually for the first time, she was represented and coded as a woman player. And reactions to this ranged from the celebratory, from competitive women players, to reactionary, from those who thought this was some kind of effort by social justice warriors in the game. And the head designer of Magic, Mark Rosewater, runs a blog where he invites questions from players. And he often uses this as an opportunity to both educate and entertain. And I'll give you an example of a question he was asked. Greetings, Mr. Rosewater. May I ask why Spike is portrayed as a female when only about 1% of professional players are girls? It's not honest to make people feel included in a representation of a player base they don't belong. And just as with Gamergate, the questioner tries to portray their question as somehow rational or honest, telling it like it is, although any reader, including Mark Rosewater, is going to be clear that they're being provocative. And when we look at who's asking the question, this reveals more. So this is someone who's created what's called a throwaway anonymous account on Tumblr to ask this question. And the name they chose says a lot about their politics. And I probably don't need to explain to this audience what this name is representing, but it's basically linking to anti-Semitic tropes such as Rob mentioned, the happy merchant. And what's also revealing about this is that they're using that name to question a game designer who openly discusses his Jewish heritage. And I'd suggest that this is both hate towards Rosewater, but also a dog whistle to other Magic players, linking the increased representation of women to wider concerns of the alt-right in relation to their perception of a culture war between left and right. So as I said, anti-Semitism is not my specific focus in the work I've done on Magic playing communities, but issues relating to transphobia, misogyny are much more apparent on the surface. But it seems like there's a lot of underlying language of anti-Semitism in some of these links with the alt-right, linking misogyny and transphobia to anti-Semitism as well. And I want to turn now to alt-right ecosystems in a wider sense before looking at how they overlap with gaming communities. So as you know, the alt-right are active on a number of different social media platforms, from the mainstream to the ones that have been created specifically for the needs of the alt-right. And whilst they predominantly exist online, as I said, they can spill into the offline world as well. When we, as critics of the alt-right, think of their politics, we normally think of things like the following. So white supremacy, misogyny, anti-Semitism, etc. But I don't think people necessarily find the alt-right because they see themselves as being interested in these phenomena particularly. I think they find it because of interests in particular topics, so things like men's rights, freedom of speech, pro-life movement, individual liberty, etc. And these things, these interest groups and websites and discussions related to them all interact with each other, often through, as Rob said, through memes, jokes, through the reification of insider knowledge, and sometimes relating to particular fandoms, so the groups of fans around a particular game or TV show or something like that. And as people get more involved, they might graduate from the kind of mainstream sites like Twitter and Facebook into the more extreme sites. So the Chans, Gab, BitChute, Parler, with Reddit and Discord operating kind of somewhere in the middle. So bringing this back to gaming. In a recent paper, Bale et al. Suggest an ecosystem framework for understanding the far right. And gaming is not inherently part of the far right or the alt-right, but it could be considered what they call a neighboring online ecosystem, and perhaps with a larger overlap with the far right online ecosystem than this diagram might suggest. And through Gamergate, the alt-right and a subset of gamers came together to attack people they considered to be on the liberal left, who the people they call the woke brigade or the social justice warriors, who they see as threatening the supremacy of Western, i.e. white, civilization. And Gamergate also gave the far right an indication of the potential power of these groups of tech-savvy gamers to spread their ideas through memes and online platforms. And a key recruitment tool of the alt-right and their kind of intersecting ecosystems, so particularly things like the manosphere or men's rights activists, their recruitment taps into things that we might see disproportionately in gaming communities. So firstly, a sense of marginalization, particularly related to vulnerable masculinities, so perhaps geek masculinities, but also an objection amongst gamers that somehow new people, often women, are coming into their spaces and trying to change things and or make them feel bad about their behaviors. And alt-right news outlets such as Breitbart have tapped into this in relation to Magic. So we see here a quote from Breitbart that's basically saying, it's not about politics. Normal people just want to enjoy their games without bringing politics into it. And this is how the alt-right taps into some of these discussions related to the perceived culture war. And even those not on the alt-right. So this is a tweet from a YouTuber and gamer who's also criticizing Wizards of the Coast for, as he sees it, pushing progressive narratives onto gaming audiences. And gaming communities are usually highly skilled, technologically adept, and very global in their reach. And as such, they have potential for positive change. But these are also the same characteristics that make them attractive to the alt-right. So thank you very much for listening. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thanks.